Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for bearing with us. This is Tara at Alaska Mill and Feed. We are recording this, so we just ask that you stay muted and if you keep your videos off as well. And we're going to go ahead and get started with the do's and don'ts of dahlias. I think that we just picked the name because alliteration is really fun. It's more of guidelines for growing great dahlias. You can ask my mother, and I'm pretty sure she's watching. I really don't like it when anybody tells me not to do something, and I just automatically try to do it anyways. So these are really guidelines just on how to grow great dahlias. If you have any questions or if you can't hear me, just go ahead and pop a note into the chat. And I have Brooke sitting next to me, and she's able to let me know when you guys have a question.
And it looks like everyone can hear you all right.
All right, this is a beautiful field of dahlias. This is from Flore Farms. They're a really great dahlia grower in the Pacific Northwest. So before we get started, just some Dahlia fun facts. They're originally from Mexico and Central America. And the hollow stems of tree dahlias can reach over 20 feet long, and they were used to carry water. And that's a picture of a tree dahlia right there. Dahlias were brought to Europe in the late 1780s, but they weren't brought for their flowers. They were brought as a food source along with tomatoes and potatoes. And the flowers back then, before they started hybridizing them, were single petal flowers. They're named after the Swedish scientist Andreas Dahl. I've also seen his name written Anders Dahl and Anderson Dahl, but I'm just going with Andreas today. And he's a Swedish scientist, and the Germans felt that one of their scientists should have the flower named after them. So for a long time, they were called Georginas in Germany. But now I think they've switched over to dahlias. And then in 1846, a Scottish Botanical Society offered £2,000 for the first blue dahlia, but we still don't have any blue dahlias yet. We have lots of other colors, but no blue ones. And then in 1963, the dahlia became the official flower of Mexico. Okay. So dahlias are members of the Asteraceae family, which is also called the Compositae family. And it's because they're composite flowers like sunflowers, daisies, and chrysanthemums. A dahlia bloom is composed of many different kinds of flowers that make up what's called an inflorescence. And so when you look at a dahlia flower, it's actually an inflorescence. And I've got a little chart for you. That's actually a chrysanthemum, but it's the same basic idea. They're made up of ray flowers, which is what we think of as the petals. And then there's central disc flowers, and there's bracts. And bracts are the greenish parts that kind of cup the flower. Many of the more decorative dahlias that we have so many ray flowers or so many petals that pollinators have a really hard time accessing the pollen and nectar. So if you want to grow dahlias specifically for pollinators, if you have a beehive and you want some flowers for them, I would stick with the single or the collarette varieties. There are a lot of different types of dahlias. There are 20 recognized types, 17 recognized colors, and then 6 different sizes. And there is a whole bunch of number and letter coding that goes into dahlias. So if you go down the hybridizing and breeding route, you will find lots of different labels that you can apply to them. And on the right-hand side are just a few examples of different kinds of dahlias. I really like the water lily type that are up at the top. The pompons, that one's a Kasasagi. They're usually only about 2 inches across, and that's going to be the smallest size. And then the dinner plates are what most people know as a giant size, and those can get up to 14 inches across. Now we're going to start with the fun part, Dahlia tubers. Dahlias are perennials and they grow from tuberous roots, and the tubers are going to produce an exact clone of the mother plant. So if you grew one of those tubers from the plant on the right, it would look exactly like that. But in Alaska, in any place that's a zone 7 or below, they're considered tender perennials. And so we need to remove the tubers from the ground before the ground freezes and store them for winter. In order for a dahlia tuber to reproduce, you have to have an unbroken neck and an eye, and we'll go over what those things are. And the size of the tuber is actually not that important as long as the tuber is healthy. And we'll also talk about what a healthy tuber is. So some of the largest dahlias have really tiny little bulbs or tubers, and it's not a problem at all. Okay, so here are some dahlia tubers, and these are ones that I have at home, and I took these pictures for you. So right in the middle, we have a pretty good example of a tuber. So the main part right there, the big fat part that looks kind of like a potato, that's the tuber. And then above it is its neck, and then there's an eye. And the eye, there's a close-up on the left-hand side of a different eye on a different tuber I have. But that's one that started to swell a little bit. When you're looking for an eye, it's sort of a little raised bump that's going to be in the crown area or right above the neck. And it's helpful if you're trying to find them if you let them sit out for a little bit so they can warm up inside. You don't need to put them under heat or anything. Just being indoors will help. And then on the right-hand side is an example of a tuber that I have. And I don't actually know if that one's going to grow anything or not. It's kind of oddly shaped, which isn't a problem, but I don't really see much of a neck on it. That could be a bit of a crown at the top, but I don't see any eyes at all yet. And I've had this one sitting out for a couple of weeks. So I'm still going to plant it, but I'm not expecting anything to happen. You can also see on the funny shaped one, there is a little bit of kind of a mold on it. And that's generally not a problem if it's right on the area where it was cut and it hasn't gone down into the tuber. So this one, when I squeeze the tuber, it doesn't feel soft. The little white fuzzy part hasn't moved to any other part of the tuber. It's just right there in that one spot, and I can easily brush it off. And these are what those tubers would hopefully turn into if everything goes well. So the emery Paul on the left-hand side is a dinner plate dahlia. The Lena and the Jenna are informal decorative style dahlias. So I'm really hoping that they work. So right now is the time when you want to start planting indoors. If you're going to start your dahlias ahead of time, mid-March to the beginning of April is a great time to do it. Depending on how big your tubers are, you can really pop them in anything from a 4-inch to a 6-inch pot. I like to use the 6-inch or gallon-sized pots just because I want them to be able to have some room for their roots to grow. Before you plant them, you're going to want to try to identify the eyes on your dahlia tubers because it's ideal to plant your dahlia tuber on its side with the eye facing up. But if you can't find the eye, then just plant it straight up and down with the tuber part at the bottom and then the neck and the crown at the top. And this allows your sprout to grow up out of the soil in the best conditions possible. You want to plant them a few inches deep, and you want the soil to be slightly moist, but not damp or soggy, and do not water them until they sprout. And I would even say don't water them very much until the sprouts are a couple of inches tall. The tubers are very susceptible to rot if they get wet. So it's almost better if they're dry right now. So just keep them dry. You also want to keep them warm, and just room temperature is okay. And you can put them under supplemental light. So I have mine under just some grow lights, but you can also put them near a really bright window as long as that window is still warm. And I've read that it's recommended to not use a heat mat. I haven't used a heat mat with mine either, but the tubers can rot from the bottom because the soil is kind of damp, and then the heat causes the dampness to rise up into the bottom of the tubers, and so they can rot that way. So your ideal outdoor growing conditions are really the same as to where you're going to plant your tomatoes. They love full sun. They love really fertile soil that's well draining. They like a pH of 6.5 to 7. You want to choose a spot that gets at least 6 hours of sun a day. 8 is better if you can do it. And it's suggested to add a good quality compost to the soil before you plant, so everything's all mixed in. My favorite compost is the Susitna that we sell here at the mill. Space your plants about 18 inches apart. If you know that the plant is going to get really big, the tag should say it, or wherever you buy it from should tell you about how large they're going to get. And if you don't find that information there, then I would just look up the variety online to see how big they're supposed to get. You can plant them as much as 3 feet apart. And then if you're going to keep them in containers, you want to choose a large planter. Wine barrels work really well, like the half wine barrels. At the very minimum, you're going to want to use a pot that's 12 inches across and 12 inches deep. And this right here is a cactus dahlia that I've grown. This one was very neglected last year. I just put the tubers in the ground when the ground was workable. It's in a sunny spot, and I kind of forgot about it. And then it was over 4 feet tall, and it did really well all summer. So they are pretty hardy plants. When you do go to plant them outside, you can transplant them when the soil reaches about 50 to 60 degrees and after the last frost date. And so plant them in the same conditions you would plant your tomatoes. So if you feel comfortable putting your tomatoes outdoors, then you're gonna be at the right time to put your dahlias out. When you transplant them, you're gonna plant them at the same soil level as they are in the pot. So don't bury the stem any deeper than it is in the pot. Make sure you harden them off first. So that means moving your plants outside to a shaded and sheltered space, and then bring them inside before the evening temperature gets cool. I usually start this about 2 weeks before I'm going to plant my dahlias out, or any of my plants. And then gradually bring them into a less sheltered, brighter area until you're in the same conditions or the exact same spot where they're going to be planted for the summer. And then once the soil's warm and there's no danger of frost, transplant them into their permanent location. And then I just repeated myself, make sure you plant them at the same soil level as they are in the pot. When I transplant mine, and pretty much when I transplant any of my plants besides brassicas, I put mycorrhizal fungi on the roots and in the planting hole. I just kind of rub it around on the outside of the root ball, and then sprinkle it into the hole. Wow, I really wanted you to know to plant them at the same soil level as they are in the pot. I think that's the 3rd time I've told you that, but really you should do that. You can also plant your tubers directly in the ground, so you can just skip the whole potting them up inside part. Once the ground's warmed up and the danger of frost is passed, you can even plant them up, I would say, about a week ahead of when you think the last frost is going to be, if you plant them deep enough, if you plant them 4 to 6 inches deep. And you could even put a little bit of a mulch on top, but it's ideal to do it after the last frost has passed. And don't forget to label what you have planted. And we do sell the mycorrhizal fungi with the beneficial bacteria, and then just a mycorrhizal fungi here at the mill as well, along with all of the plant labels you could possibly need. And it's really important for me to let you know that it's okay to not do any of this perfectly. If this seems really confusing, if you get overwhelmed looking at eyes and necks and tubers, then just stick them in a pot and see what happens. Imperfectly planted dahlias are much better than unplanted dahlias, and they're fairly resilient. They don't like to be cold, but other than that, they are pretty hardy little plants. Planting an entire group of attached tubers, like in the picture, is totally fine if you don't want to have to divide them up. I'm going to show you later in the slideshow how to divide dahlias. But if that seems like too much work, you can just stick the whole thing down in there. I would personally plant them a little bit deeper than this picture shows. I would plant them 4 to 6 inches deep, but this works. I've done this before. I get tall, beautiful dahlias. You just might not get as many dahlias because each of those tubers is its own separate plant. So if you plant them all together, you're really just going to get 1, maybe 2 plants that comes up because there's going to be too much competition for all of them to grow. And just make sure you don't water until the tubers start to sprout. Even if you plant them outside, make sure that you get sprouts before you water them. After all that serious stuff, more beautiful dahlias. This is another one from Flore Farms. So dahlias are very tall, heavy plants. Well, most of them are tall, and they get even heavier when they're covered in their blooms. So you most likely don't need to stake dahlias that are only going to get about 2 feet tall. And again, check your labels and your varieties to see which ones those are going to be. If you're in a really windy area, then I would still stake them. And you should definitely consider staking large varieties like dinner plates. That bright pink cactus dahlia that I grew, that one gets about 4 feet tall, and it's not a dinner plate, but I did not stake it because I got too busy and it fell over and it kept growing, but it's just on its side and it doesn't look as nice. It's best to place your stakes when you start planting. So as soon as you put that tuber in the ground, put a stake in next to it. And that way you're not going to disturb or damage the tubers later on in the summer. You know exactly where that tuber is, so you're not going to stab it with a stake. You don't have to worry about it when your summer starts to pick up because you're going to get busy. And even if you forget to do it or aren't able to do it at the beginning, it's still okay to stake them at any point. Just be gentle and really cautious so you don't stab any of those tubers. You can use individual stakes and lightly tie them in with string, or this looks like kind of a foam covered wire that you can find. And you want to do it about every 12 inches. So just measure up about a foot and then tie them off. And don't do it too tightly. You don't want the stem to be really snug up against the stake. Like how it's done in the picture is actually really great. There's a little bit of space and it's not so tight that the stem can't move, because you also don't want it to be rigid. And make sure that your stakes are buried deep enough so they won't fall over. Even if your ground is really nice and moist, sometimes if you only put them in a couple of inches, they will stand up when you do the initial staking, but then they'll fall over later. So make sure that you get them down in about 6 inches at least. And there's a lot of different things that you can use to stake. You can use wood stakes, bamboo poles, metal stakes, or rebar. You can also use tomato cages. They sometimes don't look as appealing because you can see the cage, but I like the ones that are coated in the green, like the green vinyl. They blend in pretty nicely with the dahlias or any other plants that you're going to use to stake that way. And if you have a whole group of dahlias together and each of them has their own tomato cage, it's a little bit harder to see the cages because all their foliage covers it up. There's something called pinching that is good to do with dahlias. And so pinching is taking off the top part of the plant, and that causes the plant to branch off, which means you get more stems, and more stems means more blooms. You get stronger stems, and then your stems get longer as well. So to do that, you just snip off the top 3 inches above a pair of leaves when the plants are about 8 to 12 inches tall. And make sure that you use clean, sharp snips. I'm pretty sure that I repeat this several times throughout the rest of the slideshow, but make sure that your snips and any tools that you're using are clean. You can also pinch with your fingers, but this kind of crushes instead of making a clean cut. So it damages more plant tissue. And so sometimes the plant has a harder time bouncing back after that kind of injury. So if you've got really nice sharp fingernails, you can just pinch, but I would recommend using snips or some kind of scissors. And I wipe my snips down with alcohol. I just get little alcohol wipes when I'm going to be out in the garden for a while so that I don't spread any diseases between plants. Even though my plants might not look like they're diseased, I don't want to spread anything. And so I try to keep my tools really clean. So there are some pests that.
We do have a question.
Oh, we have a question.
So we do have a question. Jolene's asking, is it okay to pinch off the top once the plant has developed and is hollow inside?
So is it okay to pinch off the top of the plant once it's developed and it's hollow inside? I do not know the answer to that. I think that it should still keep branching out. It just won't do it as much as if you had done it when the plant was younger. I know that it's best to do it when it's younger. I don't know the exact result if you pinch it off later.
He said thank you.
But I would absolutely recommend trying it. If you are up for experimenting with your plants, then that is the best way to learn, and then tell us what happens. Slugs and earwigs love dahlias. And so you definitely need to make sure that you have a plan to protect your dahlias from them. So for slugs, I've listed all of the different ways that I protect my plants, kind of by increasing levels. And so for slugs, the first thing I do is I put down this copper mesh netting. Slugs don't like copper, and it's not that it gives them a shock, but it makes them stop producing their mucus. So the most amount of copper that you can get them to go over to get something, it will do them the most harm. And so they can still get over this mesh netting or any copper that you put down, but it will damage them. And I've also read that it changes how they reproduce, so their offspring aren't as viable as well. So it'll reduce your slug problem later on. And you can buy this copper mesh in really large rolls. It's fairly inexpensive. And then just put up little stakes. I sometimes will just staple it around my wood boxes as well. And it looks all nice and sparkly in the sun. You can also use traps. There's the classic beer traps that you can use. I personally just put down boards or overturned pots, and then I go out in the morning and remove all the slugs that are hiding under them and get rid of them. And then there's also Sluggo products that you can use. They are organic, they're safe for organic gardening, they're safe for pets, and they're safe for children. And we sell that here. For earwigs, earwigs like to chew on the plants, and they can, especially for new sprouts, they can just sort of chew them right off at the soil level. You can use traps. I don't use traps because I don't want to touch them. But if you are fine with it, then you can use the boards or overturned pots. I've also seen pots that have a little bit of straw stuffed in them. Diatomaceous earth will also help with them. That affects insects with an exoskeleton. It gives them a whole bunch of tiny microscopic cuts, so they dry out and die, but it does not harm humans or pets. Unfortunately, it can also affect bees and other beneficial insects, so I would use it sparingly unless you have a real big problem with them. And then Sluggo Plus will take care of earwigs as well. And so if you get a big jug of Sluggo Plus, it'll handle your slugs and your earwigs.
So we do have another question about snipping. Do you snip only once for each plant?
So the question was, do you snip only once for each plant? I personally do, but you can do it more than once. It'll just keep getting bushier. I don't know if any of you have done the pinching or the snipping with basil, but it's the same exact idea where you just keep pinching, and as it grows, it'll just keep getting bushier and kind of more round in shape. You'll get more branches. And more pests are aphids and thrips. And so aphids really like lush new growth. That's why you see them a lot of times on new leaves or the flower buds before the flowers have even opened. They really like that new plant material. And nitrogen is something that's going to increase that. So hold off on giving them lots of nitrogen. And I will talk about fertilizer in just a little bit and fertilizer recommendations. You can attract beneficial insects. You can bring in ladybugs. You can use row cover too. So when you first plant them, when they're sprouts, you can put some row cover down on top of them. You can wash off with water. My first thing that I do when I realize that a plant has a bunch of aphids on it, if it's not a very delicate plant, then I just spray it with a really sharp blast of water and try to spray as many of them off as I can. And then you can also use insecticidal soaps. But insecticidal soaps can affect other beneficial insects, so it's kind of a toss-up. And then for thrips, I included a picture of thrips. They're the little tiny black guys. They kind of snake around a little bit. For those, attracting beneficial insects is great, and make sure that you're watering regularly and that your dahlias aren't under any moisture stress because they are attracted to moisture stress. So don't overwater them and don't underwater them. You can also wash the thrips off with water, but they are very tiny and they're very good at hiding, so it's a little bit harder. You can use beneficial nematodes. They're basically little tiny beneficial worms that live in the soil and infect other bad insects. You can use diatomaceous earth for them, but same thing goes where it might hurt beneficial insects. And then you can use the insecticidal soap and other sprays. We have the Safer 3-in-1 garden spray in the summer. And I like to use that one when I do need to resort to a spray because it also takes care of fungal and bacterial problems. It can help with those as well. And that brings us to some diseases. Crown gall is something that affects dahlias. It's bacterial, and there's a picture of it in the lower right. It affects the tubers, and there's no cure for it. You just have to destroy the entire plant. It's something that's in the soil, and if you do get crown gall, then I would recommend not putting anything in that soil that you're going to want to harvest the tubers or the roots from. So don't put potatoes there later. And so preventing fungal diseases like powdery mildew and botrytis, you want to keep your garden very clean of plant debris. So as your blossoms and your leaves fall off, just make sure you clean that all up. Make sure the plants have adequate airflow and ventilation. Something that's good to do is when your plants get a few feet tall is to take off the bottom leaves for like the first foot. Just sort of peel those off so that the stems have some airflow down at the bottom. And try to water the soil and not the leaves. So don't spray and water from the top down. Try to just get the soil. And drip irrigation is really great for them, but you can also just take your hose and just spray down at the base. Viral diseases can be harder to prevent. If you are worried about viral diseases, then you can look up different dahlia types that have resistance to viral diseases. But when you do identify a virus, then it's best to just remove the entire plant and destroy it. And viruses, if you've ruled out things like moisture stress and fungal disease and a bacterial disease, then a lot of times a viral disease will look like your plants are kind of yellowing from the inside and their leaves might be sort of streaky. Make sure you don't compost any diseased plant material. You don't want to spread it to anything else, and most compost piles don't get hot enough to kill any of this. And as always, sanitize your garden equipment. Even if you don't think your plants are diseased, just make sure that you're sanitizing and keeping everything clean in between plants. Well, we're pretty dahlias after all that disease talk. Fertilizing dahlias. So it's always a good idea to do a soil test before you fertilize anything, before you really grow anything. You can send out for soil tests. You can send your soil out so it can get tested in a laboratory, and the UAF Cooperative Extension has really great resources on how to do that. Or you can just use one of these little soil test kits like we sell in the store. It gives you a good baseline. It tells you what the pH is, how much nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, because you don't want to over fertilize your plants. That can cause problems just as much as having not enough nutrients will cause problems. I know that somebody wrote in with, she gets really great dahlia plants. They're nice and green and tall, but she's not getting any blooms. And it could be because her soil has too much nitrogen in it. I think she said that she had stopped fertilizing them, but the nitrogen might still be in the soil. And so moving to a different location might help with that. So once your flowers start blooming, you can apply a balanced fertilizer at the time that you plant them. And so a balanced fertilizer, all the numbers are going to be the same. It's going to be like a 5-5-5 or a 1-1-1, something like that. But once the flowers start, then you're going to want to switch to using a fertilizer that's low in nitrogen, a 0-10-10 or a 5-10-10. And this is because the nitrogen promotes growth of leaves and stems, and that's great. We do want our dahlias to have strong and beautiful leaves and stems, but we are really interested in the flowers. And so if we give it too much nitrogen, then the plant is just going to keep making really beautiful leaves, but not really beautiful flowers. Phosphorus is used by the whole plant, but especially for flowers, and potassium is used throughout the plant as well, but it really helps with flowers and with root growth. And if you do choose to fertilize, then do it every 3 to 4 weeks, but stop at early autumn because your plants aren't going to need to keep growing that much longer. And the best way to get more blooms is to keep deadheading. So the one on the left, the picture on the left, that is a new bloom. So you want to keep that. It's nice and rounded. The bracts, those green leafy bits, they're nice and green. You can kind of see where the petals are forming, and it's just going to pop right open. But on the right-hand side, when it gets pointy like that, that is a spent bloom. So it's dropped its petals, and it's not going to do anything anymore. So you can get rid of that, or you can save it for seeds. And I will go over seeds. Oh, there are seeds. Okay, going over seeds now. So tubers are the only way to get an exact clone of the mother dahlia plant. So if you want your dahlia to look exactly the same every year, you're going to need to collect the tubers. If you have different varieties of dahlias and you allow your plants to open pollinate, so you don't control how they pollinate, you just let the wind and the bugs do their thing, then you're not going to know exactly how your seeds are going to come out. So it'll be a surprise, which can be fun. If you want to breed specific dahlias together, then it's recommended to hand pollinate them and then cover those blooms with a fine mesh bag so that you know exactly what plants pollinated that and nothing's going to come behind and pollinate it with something else. And there are books on how to do this, and I have a book recommendation in the resources at the end if you are interested in breeding and pollinating dahlias. Even if you have two of the same variety and they cross-pollinate, so if you have two emery Paul dahlias, they might produce flowers that are a little bit different. Dahlias have a lot of chromosomes. Most plants have one set, but dahlias are octoploids and they have 4 sets. And so lots of crazy things can happen with dahlias when they get pollinated. If you are choosing to save your seeds, instead of deadheading, then leave your spent dahlia bloom on the plant. So when it gets that pointy looking thing, leave it on there. The petals are going to drop off and the seed pod will start to form. And so that was a seed pod starting to form in the previous slide. If you squeeze your seed pod and it drips juice, then it's not ready. But some gardeners do squeeze the juice out every couple of days to speed up the seed pod ripening. So you can go out there and test it and just kind of milk a couple of drops of the juice out to help it dry out. You can also harvest the seed pods before they're ripe by cutting the stems and then putting them in water indoors. Just put them in a jar. And after about a week or two, lay your seed pods out to dry. And once all that plant material is dry and feels really papery, then you can collect the seeds. And once you have the seeds collected, it's really best to store them in paper so they can kind of breathe and not plastic bags. You can store them in plastic bags, but it's just really not recommended. And then keep them someplace cool and dry like you do with all your other seeds. And don't forget to label your seed packets. Even if you think you'll remember, you probably won't. This is the fun part, digging up tubers. So dahlias, they bloom really well, like midsummer all the way up. I have dahlias until dahlia plants blooming until the last hard frost that we get. I mean, they're just amazing. Well, I guess the first hard frost, that's when they start to die. So after the first hard frost kills your plants, wait about 2 weeks to harvest the tubers because you want those tubers to have enough time to cure in the ground. But the trick is that you have to take them out of the ground before it freezes. So pay attention to them. Once the plant dies, kind of keep checking on the calendar and take them out after about, I would say, 10 to 14 days. Remove your stakes and cut down the stalk a few days before you're going to harvest the tubers. So when you cut down the foliage and the stem, it can make the eyes be more prominent. So if you're going to divide your tubers up in the fall, it'll make it a little bit easier. It's good to leave enough stem to make a good handle, but you're going to want to cover the stem because it's hollow and the open exposed stem can get water inside of it. So just cover it up with like a little bit of aluminum foil. And make sure you use clean tools and sanitize your tools with a bleach solution. So a good bleach solution is usually 1 part bleach to 10 parts water. I've also seen 9 parts water, but I do 10 parts. And make sure that your bleach solution is cold too. Bleach can get inactivated when it's hot. Be really careful when you're digging up your clump of tubers. You're going to start about 1 foot away from the stem on all 4 sides. So kind of make a square and just dig lightly into the ground and loosen up those really long roots. So you're just going to sort of slowly start prying everything up. And when the long roots are all loose, then you can slide your fork or your shovel underneath the clump and then lift everything up. You can use the handle to help you, but don't pull from the stem handle because that can damage the tubers, the crown of the tubers. If you're going to divide your tubers in the fall, then wash them off and let them dry upside down so all the water gets out of the stem. So I just put mine in a bowl because I put them in a sort of bowl that's smaller than how wide the tubers are, so that the tubers rest on the edge of the bowl gently and everything drains out. If you're going to divide them in the spring though, you can just gently shake them off or brush off most of the dirt, but don't wash them. So on the left, that's unwashed and ready for storing. And on the right, those are washed and shiny tubers ready for dividing. And don't forget to label them. If you're going to divide them up. Once they're all cleaned, you can actually write on them with like a Sharpie, just what variety they are. Some people use tags that they can stick in the box with them. Some people use flagging tape and they write the variety on there and kind of tie it onto the stem. So just find a way that works for you and use it. I think in the picture on the right, they have like little flagging sticks stuck in there in the stems. So dividing up tubers, you can divide them in the fall or you can divide them in the spring before you plant them. If your tuber clump has soil on it, wash it off with clean water and let it dry. You can either spray them down with a hose outside or you can wash them inside if there's not too many rocks and things on there. If your clump is really large, then cut it in half so that it's more manageable for you to work with it. And then remove any broken and damaged tubers. So any broken necks, you're going to want to remove those tubers because they're not going to be viable. If you can see like little stringy bits in the neck, then that's broken and it most likely will not grow the next year. You're going to try to look for eyes. Remember that every tuber needs an eye in order to grow into a new plant. And so there's a picture on the right and I have circled the eyes for you. They're sort of a darker color and tiny points. It's a trick to learn how to identify them, but once you practice, you'll get good at it. And you're going to split your tuber clump into individual tubers. And remember, they need a neck, a crown, and hopefully an identifiable eye. And there's a really good splitting guide online by Summer Dreams Farm, and that's where this picture is from. And there's really no way for me to explain it to you any better. So if you are interested in dividing tubers up like this, I highly recommend you go. He has tons of photos and he's done a very good job of explaining the process. And this is another one of his photos. So he divided up a clump and that clump is going to be 8 new plants. And you can see that each of these tubers has an unbroken neck. It's nice and straight and it has a piece of crown on it, the knobby part at the top. He just put a battery in there for scale. That is one thing, he's really obsessed with scale and size. So all of his pictures pretty much have scale in them. Remember to use the clean tools and sanitize in between clumps. Even if your plants didn't have any diseases, still sanitize in between each clump. And there are a lot of different videos on YouTube that are helpful. If you learn better that way than from just pictures, then just look up on YouTube how to divide and you'll have many resources. So storing is a big thing. There are a lot of different methods though, and the way that I do it might not work for you. So I store my clump. I don't divide it in the fall. I'll divide it in the spring, or if I get lazy, then I will just plant the whole thing. But I put it in a cardboard box that has clean, dry potting soil in it. And then I close the cardboard box and I keep it in my crawl space. You can use, instead of soil, you can use shredded paper or coarse vermiculite. You can use a plastic bag that has holes, or you can leave the top of the bag open. You can use a plastic tub with ventilation, and that ventilation could be just like leaving the lid sort of slightly askew. You can use a garbage can that has holes drilled in it. There are a lot of different ways that you can do this, but ideally you should be storing them somewhere cool that's between 40 and 50 degrees. If they're too moist, they're going to rot or mold. And if they're too dry, then they become desiccated and dried out and they don't have any viable material in them for you to actually plant and grow anything from. And the right storing method really depends on the environment where you store your tubers. I've also seen them stored just in sort of open crates, but I know that the environment I'm in is too dry for that. My crawl space is like slightly damp, probably more damp than it should be, but it keeps them from drying out, but they would definitely dry out if they were just in a crate and not in a box. If you're just starting out, then I really recommend trying a couple of different ways and putting some tubers in one method and then some in another, just to see which one works best for where you are. And if your neighbors have really great dahlias, then ask them how they store their tubers, because it's really likely that somebody close to you, their method is going to work well for you. And these are some different methods that are out there. So on the very left side, those are Ziploc bags, and they have coarse vermiculite in there and individual tubers. In the middle top, there's one method where you wash the tubers, you divide them, you let them dry, and then you wrap them up in saran wrap. Bottom is a box that's filled with shredded paper. The right looks like it's one of those yard hefty bag things filled with tubers that still have the, they still have all the dirt on them. And then the right-hand side is the cardboard box with some soil. And if you notice, the soil is not very wet at all.
We do have a question.
Sure.
Is it successful to keep in pot over the winter and start again?
Yes. So the question is it successful to keep in a pot over winter and start again? Yes, you can do it that way. You still want to cut down the foliage, and you want to store it someplace indoors in the same conditions that you would store your tubers. So someplace like 40 to 50 degrees, not too cold, not too warm, and someplace where they're not going to dry out too much. If you can, it's kind of nice if you can take them out of the pot sort of in the middle of winter and just make sure they're not getting too dry or too wet, but also okay if that if you don't have time to do that. Okay, just because I have to, some do's and don'ts. So do pot up your tubers in mid to late March if you're starting indoors. Do try to find the eye of the tuber and plant the tuber on its side, eye up. Do add compost to your transplant location, and do plant in full sun and have a plan to protect against pests. If you fertilize, use low nitrogen, and deadhead for more blooms. Experiment and find a storing method that works for you, and have fun. And don'ts are, don't water newly planted tubers until they sprout. Don't panic about not being able to find the eye. It's probably going to be just fine. Just plant it the best you can. Don't fertilize with too much nitrogen. Really can't emphasize this enough. Don't spray water on the blooms and leaves if possible. Try to water the base of the plant, the soil. Don't remove your tubers from the ground before they have a chance to cure, but also don't let your tubers freeze in the ground, and don't panic.
Okay, we do have a question. Do you cover them with soil in the box?
Do you cover them with soil in the box? Yes. That picture doesn't show that they're covered up, but yes, I put down soil in the bottom of the box, and then I put my tubers in. I like to have mine up and down, and you can sort of make, like, if your tuber clump is sort of hollow in the middle and the tubers all go off to the sides, then you can kind of make a little volcano shape with your soil and then put the tubers down on top of them and then cover them up with more soil. So basically you just want them all covered up with soil so that they don't get dried out. And here are some resources that I recommend. That's my email address. So if you have any questions or if you want me to go over something again, then you can email me here at the mill. I also usually take Wednesdays and Thursdays off, but I'm here the rest of the time. So you are more than welcome to come into the store and ask for me, and I will answer your questions. If you do email me, I don't have a desk. I work in the store and the greenhouse. So I usually take a couple of days to answer emails. And if you don't hear back from me within a few days, then you should call or email. I know I've responded to a few people and they didn't get my emails for some reason. So I am not ignoring you. I will answer you. The UAF Cooperative Extension, I don't think they have anything. They might have one thing specifically on dahlias, but they are just a very good resource. You can go online and you can download any of their publications for free. You can also call them or email them and ask them questions. Then the Alaska Master Gardeners, they have information on growing dahlias in Alaska. There's the American Dahlia Society, and then a lot of different states and areas have their own particular Dahlia Society. I know there's the Portland Dahlia Society, and that's a really good resource too. The National Dahlia Society is a UK-based one, but that has great information. And I like the Alaska Master Gardener, so I included it twice for you. You should go check that out. Flore Flowers, it's Erin, I think her name's Benziken, and she wrote a book called Discovering Dahlias. It's a really great book. It goes over pretty much everything that I went through, sometimes in more depth, sometimes not. But you can get that at local bookstores. She is the one who has most of the pictures of dahlias that I showed you. And she's got just a really great farm in the Pacific Northwest. And then Summer Dreams Farm, that's the one that has the great splitting guide and just other information on dahlias. And then if you are interested in dahlia breeding, then the book Dahlia Breeding is one that you should definitely check out.
Do you have another question?
Sure.
If your potted dahlia is too dry midwinter, how do you add water?
If your potted dahlia is too dry midwinter, how do you add water? I would probably spritz it lightly with water. I don't think that I would pour water around it, or I would maybe take like a wet towel and wrap it around the pot so that it can kind of absorb some water, but you're not soaking it, if that makes sense. And you can also put it in a plastic bag if it starts to dry out too much. You could put it in a plastic bag with like a damp washcloth or something like that, kind of like you would with brown sugar that's gone hard. You just want to sort of infuse some moisture into it without getting it wet, if that makes sense. And if there are any more questions, now is a great time.
So far. Again, we did record this class, so we will probably be importing that into our YouTube probably first thing Monday. So everybody that registered for this class, you should be getting that YouTube link by Monday at the latest. So if you don't see it by Tuesday morning, just go ahead and give us a call and we can make sure we get that link to you. There's a lot of great resources on this presentation. So it's always a good thing to have. You can share it with other people if you'd like, but you will need that link to watch it. We have somebody said, thank you. I've been trying to take this class for years, always so full. So thrilled to be able to take from my home with a cup of coffee. Looking forward to a colorful summer. Us too.
Yeah, I can't wait to get my dahlia. Well, I've started my dahlias indoors, and we should be getting another shipment of dahlia bulbs. What we ordered from the vendor came in one shipment, and then we're supposed to be getting the next half of it. And they have been telling us different dates, but we are hoping that this upcoming week is when we get more. And we do have some of the dinner plate dahlias I know people have asked me about that we have ordered that should be coming. If you can't wait for that, then there is somebody who sells dahlia bulbs or dahlia tubers at the Midtown Mall, Hatcher Pass Dahlias, and there might be some other locations too, but that's the one that I know of.
What is the likely problem if your blooms are incomplete? Flowers is only partially formed.
Ooh, what is the likely problem if your blooms are incomplete and flowers are partially formed? I would test your soil and see what you've got going on there. And if your like initial soil test looks fine, then I would maybe think about sending out a soil sample. If you've grown other things there and you haven't had a problem, then it could be something that's bacterial or viral as well. That could be something that's happening. Sometimes when things like that happen to plants, it can be like some of the smaller micronutrients, like not the nitrogen and the phosphorus, but more of the magnesium and the calcium and things like that. But I don't know off the top of my head what might be doing it.
Perfect. That was the last question we have. Oh, just kidding. When did you start your dahlias? How are you lighting them? Do you keep them in the house or move them before the transition?
Okay, so when did I start my dahlias? I just potted my dahlias up while I was making this presentation this week so I could take pictures for you. So mid-April or mid-March to beginning of April is a good time to start for us here in Alaska. You can also put them outside in the ground after the danger of frost has passed. So for us, that's traditionally the end of May. It has moved up a little bit. We can always still get a frost until the end of May, but usually mid-May is when I start doing it. And then you want to make sure that you harden off your transplants. You don't need to harden off your tubers if you're just going to stick them straight into the ground outside, but you do want to harden off your transplants that you start indoors. And then how did I light them? So I light mine, I just have grow lights for starting my seeds and things like that. So I just pop them underneath there. You don't really need that much light for them until they sprout. So if you just potted them up, then you can put them in a bright window. And you just need to have them inside the house. You want them around 60, 70 degrees so that they will start sprouting and growing. Did I answer everything?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, they did ask, do you keep them in the house or move them before the transition? But you answered that with
Okay.
burning off. Everyone's saying thank you. So it looks like we don't have any more questions. So we're going to go ahead and end the presentation. Thank you so much again for joining.